it might be a good sign that Sony's simply not willing to release games that are not up to snuff. I think that's kind of a good sign. Entwined wasn't a very good game. I reviewed it at IGN. You can go check out my review. It was fine. But Concrete Genie, which I platinumed, was also fine. To me, it didn't shout modern day PlayStation because it wasn't a third person over the shoulder shooter. It didn't scream PlayStation because it wasn't a 9. While the potential of them working on an animated project with Sony Pictures is really exciting, and potentially maybe it could have been a Spider-Man game or something else, I don't know that I'm like really lamenting this. It's not like losing Sucker Punch. It's not like losing Gorilla. And like I said, Japan Studios closure, which they would argue wasn't a closure, but it obviously was much more catastrophic to the brand than this. So, Dustin, I'm curious, what do you think about PixelOpus's exit from the scene?
Sony's not interested in good small games that don't sell. You know, that era of the smaller Sony game is gone.
Yeah, like Journey.
Right. Stuff like that. Or even remaking a game like Medieval, or making a game like Everybody's Golf, stuff like that. That Sony is gone.
Yeah, Gravity Rush is a good example of that too.
Yeah, Gravity Rush is, these are all great examples of that type of game that they were once in the market of making. And if you look, I just looked up in November of 2019 when Concrete Genie came out, the PSN top downloads of 20 games, Concrete Genie isn't on it. And I don't know if it may have charted later on, but I kind of don't think so. And so I think that it's saying something about that they did care about the team, that they kept going with them despite two, and I don't mean this too negatively, but two mediocre games. Not that they're bad, they're just fine, as Colin was saying, right? So they stuck with them regardless. And like you said, I think that it has to do with this next project just wasn't shaping up. And then, so there's that in combination with a new Sony strategy that's not the same, which, by the way, I get it, but I think this new strategy for Sony kind of sucks because, I don't know, as a fan of those smaller games like Everybody's Golf, the fact that we're not getting anything like that anymore is disappointing. I get it. You want to go for the blockbusters. That's what really makes you the money. And I love those type of games, but I also really appreciate those smaller games. But,
I do too. I totally hear you there. I mean, Sony publishes fewer games than ever. They used to publish, Jaffe was bringing this up, and it's true. There were years where Sony published like 100 games, literally. Mm-hmm. And now they publish 3. You know, it is, things have definitely changed. Like Tokyo Jungle is a good example of that. That game Rain, Datora, Linger in Shadow, those days are done. Yeah.
You feel bad for a team getting shut down, but one, it sounds like a lot of them got absorbed into the greater Sony.
That's how I read it on LinkedIn. I don't know. Yeah. You know, it's just Sony didn't say anything about laying anyone off. That one guy, Dominic Robier or whatever, has been with Sony for 20 years. And I feel like you can't, as far as I understand, they are in Sony HQ in San Mateo. So there's not even like a building space. They're kind of like how that game company used to work and Giant Sparrow used to work at Santa Monica back in the day. So I think that there's probably very little overhead and probably a couple dozen people. And so I just don't think it matters. I hate to say that. I feel bad. I think PixelOpus is cool, and I wish I saw what they maybe it'll leak, whatever they were working on. But Sony moves on. I mean, I was talking to Jaffe recently. We talked about it on the show at the time, I believe, but that Sucker Punch game Prophecy was canceled in between Infamous Second Son and Ghost of Tsushima. There's fucking gameplay footage of it. It looks pretty. I mean, I'm sure it's a vertical slice, but it looks pretty damn AAA too. You know. So if they're going to cancel shit like that, I imagine they're not going to have any problem canceling this stuff.
It really does feel like if you can't contribute to their new live service initiative, or if you can't make this over the shoulder, cinematic, over dramatic, or RPG light, story heavy game, then you're just not in it. I do feel like there's especially with Media Molecule in the shape that it's in, following all this dreams, all the dream shutdown stuff, it just feels like there's such a lack of flavor in first party that I can't help but notice. And it's a little frustrating too, because if you are somebody who like looks at the first party and you're like, okay, you have over the shoulder third person action RPG like game, third person over the shoulder action RPG like game, you know, and you're a little bit bored with that. And then you look over at Xbox and they're releasing like broken, you know, like, you know, like where do you go? I feel kind of like I'm in a place where I feel like remarkably underserved by the industry right now. Because like the interesting stuff that could exist is over at Xbox and it's broken and it doesn't work and no one can figure out how to do it. And the stuff that's really, really good is derivative. And it is kind of a shame to have, you know, just this lack of flavor. And I wouldn't necessarily say that PixelOpus was the biggest contributor to that flavor. I think arguably Media Molecule and like maybe Japan Studio were a little bit more in that vein. But like it, I don't know, man. I just want more of that flavor back.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. I think that there's no denying that compared to its competition in Xbox, Sony has a much more monotypical first party family that does. You can't deny polyphony and all of that. Like,
of course, yeah,
Media Molecule, I guess, and whatever. But generally speaking, they don't even make shooters anymore, right? So it's like first person shooters. So I agree with you there. And when you go back, it's interesting looking at the brands that they've shut down and why. I don't know that any of these studios until more recently, in fact, I know that they weren't shut down because they couldn't deliver the next game. That's why I feel a little bit less bad for PixelOpus, because they at least had a chance. And who knows, maybe what they were working on was awesome and Sony just said this still doesn't make sense for us. But I don't think so. You know, because why would you? That's like such a sunk cost. And I would think that, and I'm looking through the list as I put it, like Incognito was closed down after Warhawk, I want to say. And then Big was shut down after Little Deviants. Yeah. So that was a Vita game. SOCOM was shut down after SOCOM 4 and Unit 13, which both kind of, I thought Unit 13 was awesome, but kind of failed.
That felt like the most unjust one.
Well, that's the one that if they could probably undo, in hindsight, they would probably undo. Was like, oh, we shouldn't have done that. Because they could have had this marinating. I know for a fact, because I know people that worked at Zipper, that SOCOM 5 was going to be a thing on PlayStation 4. Like that was what the next game was. You know, so but that the rug was pulled out from under them, and they made Unit 13. My friend Jeremy Dunham wrote Unit 13, who was the founder of Podcast Beyond, and they made that game in like 6 months. They just didn't give them any time, you know, and it's pretty impressive because another game that was made there were two other games on Vita that were made in 6 months or less: Resistance Burning Skies and Call of Duty Declassified or whatever, and both of those games suck. And Unit 13 definitely doesn't suck. And those other two games both came from the same studio, Nihilistic, of course. And then when you look at the other teams that closed, so yeah, Liverpool was a weird one because Liverpool was Psygnosis, and Psygnosis is their first team. So that was a weird gut punch to a lot of people because it's like, whoa, man. And that happened after Wipeout 2048. And then Evolution was probably the biggest example of you failed. And that was after Drive Club.
Yeah.
And Gorilla Cambridge, which used to be Sony Cambridge, they did Riggs, so they were out, and Mercenary, of course, on Vita. And then Manchester Studio. So this is when it begins that studios start failing in development.
Internally.
Yeah. Right. Manchester Studio never even releases a game after 3 years, or never even announces a game. Didn't necessarily release a game in that period, but they never announced anything. And then Japan Studio, clearly something went awry there. But at the same time, what happened with Japan Studio is almost the exact opposite of what we're saying, in the sense that they said, we're actually going to reduce the size of this extremely. And Team Asobi is, if anything, maybe the most promising creative team that they have. So it could go in both directions, but I don't know, man. I'm not saying this just to be a defender of PlayStation Studios at all. It's just PixelOpus is maybe the least important studio Sony owns. No, with no disrespect to them. The times have changed. If they were alive during the PS3 era of PSN, they probably would have been a big team. When Sony would have an event every month that I would go to where they'd have 7 new fucking, PSN games to play. And you're like, where did this shit even come from? Escape Plan and Fat Princess. But yeah, those days are done. And I don't necessarily blame them. Little risk, little gain. Big risk, big gain.